Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, thank you so much for joining us once again on another episode of the Coffee Roaster Warm-Up Sessions podcast. After a little bit of a 2-week hiatus, I was gone out of the country. Things got a little busy as they can be, running a roasting company with a lot of moving parts and all that jazz. We are back, and I'm excited. It feels like every time we don't have a podcast for like a week or two, it feels so weird to be back. It's like you're just out of flow, out of the gist of things. But we are pouring some batchy as we always do. And wow, just from you pouring, it's already smelling like it's filling the room. There's something tasty in here. Wow.
That's nice.
What's the first thing you noticed? What's the first thing that came to mind?
I always know just textures first. Very silky, very clean.
Unfortunately, I'm going to say the same thing.
It's just very nice mouthfeel.
It has a spectacular mouthfeel. I don't really know. I'm sure it's probably a little bit of the roast, but I don't know exactly where the exact mouthfeel would come from. Maybe a little bit from the coffee, a little bit from the roast, a little bit from the brew probably.
I think it's a little bit of everything.
Yeah, a little bit of everything. But, man, this is just so nice on the palate. It's so nice and soft. A little bit of, like, bubble gum almost.
Candied pineapple.
Yeah.
A little bit of strawberry. Like, there's a lot of fruit.
Yeah.
It's not, like, punchy like a natural. It's punchy like a washed. I don't know what process this coffee. But it's very punchy. It also has
a lot of floral, a lot of, like bright florals, maybe, like, rose, maybe, like, a candied rose almost. I don't know, lavenders, candied lavender. It's pleasant. It's very complex, actually. And it's a very nice coffee.
Man, I would take it as far as even like almost like a canned peach. Yeah, like a lot of canned peach. In the sweetness is also so dynamic that it also tastes a lot like chocolate covered berries. But not in, I think a lot of the times that is thrown around in underwhelming kind of cheaper coffees, but that's not how it tastes.
Yeah.
It tastes like very deluxe, for lack of better words.
It's very, honestly, it also doesn't taste like a Kenyan, which it is. It does not taste like a Kenyan at all. Kenyans usually have this like tart, like currants, kind of that, but this does not taste like that. It actually tastes like clean, crisp, like almost like borderline like in Ethiopia for some reason. Borderline kind of, but actually very distinct from that as well.
Yeah, very distinct from an Ethiopian. I'm not getting much florals on it. I'm just getting a lot of very nice fruit, like bright fruit and berries.
Oh man, this is very nice. This is just a treat. Wow. This is a coffee brought to you by, I think it's Rose Coffee Roasters. I recently, for those of you who don't follow me on Instagram, which is probably a lot of you actually, I just came back from a trip to Europe, and we stopped by Switzerland, and in Zurich there was a small little cafe bakery called Collective Bakery, which I think Matt Winton roasts for, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. And Matt is a low-key legend. Not low-key, high-key legend.
Yeah.
Sorry, Matt, if you're listening. But I will say this is a beautifully roasted, beautifully sourced, phenomenal Kenyan coffee. It's a carbonic maceration natural. Can you grab it?
That makes sense.
Just want to make sure I'm not saying anything wrong.
That makes sense.
SL28, SL34 varietals, CM natural. in quotation mark Jasper. I don't know what that means. This Kenyan coffee is it's got flavor notes: bright, rich, red, and purple fruit, whatever that means. But this Kenyan coffee is unique due to its processing. Ripe cherry from around the Taigini region are brought to the factory where it's sorted and fermented with carbonic maceration before being dried naturally in cherry.
Gotcha. That's what confused me.
But it is very clean. To name this a natural I don't think is very fair.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't have that insane booziness or fermentiness.
It's outstanding.
Yeah.
Wow. Impressed. I don't think I've ever had a CM or natural from Kenya. I'm trying to think. This may be my first natural from Kenya.
Man, this is so good. It's like as it cools, it's just this.
It just doesn't leave your mouth too.
Yeah. Oh man.
The flavors are just hang out for a very long time.
Wow. That's, yeah. Wow. This is such a. I'm so glad we brewed this because this is just so freaking good.
Yeah, I don't even like using the word complex. It feels dynamic. I don't know. Maybe that's how my mind thinks. Like complex, I still visually see something as linear when I say complex, almost like a graph, like a 2-dimensional graph. This tastes very 3-dimensional to me, like very dynamic.
Yeah. Wow. Excellent. Wow. Shout out to Rose Coffee Roasters for just absolutely killing this and presenting us with a very tasty coffee to enjoy. So
incredible.
Whoop whoop. Yeah. Wow, that has taken most of my brain space right now. But that being said, we're back with another episode of the Coffee Roaster Warm Sessions podcast. We often get questions asked about what kind of gear are we using. People ask me like, how long have you been doing the podcast? What is that like? And so we kind of wanted to jump in on this for a little bit. But Sergi, why don't you tell us, give us a little bit of a backstory origin to the MCRWS. Wait, MRC. Oh, no, MC. Yeah.
Yeah, MCRWS. No,
podcast.
warm-up session. Yeah, SP, WSP.
It's not.
Wait, isn't WSP the button you press on the router to send out a signal?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, so that's how I remember
it. It is not acronym friendly here.
No, totally. Basically, I have a few keen and very sweet memories of in the beginning, especially Mirror started in the winter. So I remember roasting in the winter in our roastery and talking about different ideas, and Mirror's just like starting. So there's not much to kind of talk about that we've done. It's more or less like our vision, mission, kind of brainstorming sessions would happen as we are turning on the roaster, maybe cleaning stuff up, preparing for the roast day. And we'd sit and just have these amazing conversations, and sometimes also very challenging conversations because we didn't know what's going to happen to me or how are we going to grow this. Like we were learning a lot. And during that time, I remember either you, I believe it was you, said, this is the type of content that people need to hear. This is how people should get to know us through this more or less brainstorming process, but also this raw idea of what are we doing? How are we doing this? Like, how are people doing this? What's the industry look like? Like a lot of big industry questions were processed in that time. And then I remember when we agreed on doing a podcast, some of our first sessions inside the roastery, we'd take our cupping table, move it right in front of the roaster. Did we even have a light? You didn't even own this light yet, right? We had no lights, just basic lights in the room and one camera wide, just one wide shot of us.
There was that, yeah.
It was such an interesting time, but it also we started the podcast with the idea of we want to share information and not necessarily be like the smartest kids in the class kind of thing, but also just share our thought process. Yeah. What are we doing? Why are we doing this? We wanted people to get to know us as we get to know people through, whether it's the comment section, replies, or even people would call us. Like I think within the first couple of months, people started calling us, So it was a very unique, very interesting time.
Yeah, that's spot on. I mean, it's just a big throwback to those days.
Yeah.
It's like, man, I sometimes you look back and, well, sometimes it feels like in the moment you're like, nothing changes or very little has changes and you're making very little increments. And when you look back and you're like, oh, damn, like 115 episodes back when Mira was just getting off the ground, and you're like, wow, there's been a lot of learning since then. And I think actually, apart from, what we always say is like, this is the content that we wish we would listen to when we're starting the coffee roasting company. Like, I think there needs to be more, even though it's right now, there's more information about coffee circulating than there has ever been, but I still don't think there's enough, especially in the podcast realm. I mean, that being said, like, it's actually really challenging to have a podcast about coffee. Like, right. This may feel like you're like, oh, cool, I get to watch the Coffee Roaster Warm sessions every weekend. But it's like, oh, no, like, this takes a good chunk of our week. Like, this takes time. And it's just free content that we just produce because we think it's fun. We also think it's valuable for people. But that all being said, apart from thinking like, man, we wish this would be available to us and sharing to people our journey, but also something I've been thinking about is how important it is to be documenting a process.
That's good.
Because, man, I think coming back from Europe, I might go on a rabbit trail here, but a lot of people say, man, you just need to live in the moment. Don't be taking photos or whatever. Don't be on your phone too much and all this. And I agree. There's a lot of truth to that. Like, experience your life firsthand. But something I've also realized is, like, when you take photos, you're actually saving a specific moment in time forever, for good. Like, you probably won't remember the color of the building that was on X street, 10 years ago. You probably won't remember that. But if you have a photo of it, you're like, oh man, that's what that building looked like. That's what the weather was like. That's what it becomes very tangible. And something that I've been thinking about from that was just realizing, like, man, how important it is to be able to document your process, because you might not remember all the details, but when you look back or you listen back in this case, you're like, oh, okay, that's what was going on. Like, I can't tell you exactly what we were maybe talking about 2 years ago in the month of February. But now guess what? I have this backlog that I can go back and listen to, and actually it'll take me back. And I think there's so much value in that because, I mean, just for yourself, just for your sake, but also it gives you, again, a tangible way of measuring your success and your growth.
And I think photography is only 150 years old. So it hasn't been that long since we've had that ability to capture and almost encapsulate a moment visually. And now with video, the dynamic is even bigger because we're recording these conversations. We're also, it's not just audio. Now we have this combination of, one, what we're talking about, but also how we're talking about it, our faces on it. You know what I mean? Those things kind of encapsulate these moments and help us not only preserve them, but then reflect on them and learn again. We 100%. Might even relearn things just by listening to our podcasts in the past, because we can see, okay, that's how we grew, but now it's even a whole new dynamic. So for me, it's like exponential when you do stuff like this.
And I think, I'm not going to lie, every time somebody comments on one of these podcasts is like, yo, I just found your podcast and I'm binging from episode 1. I'm like, please don't. like nobody go back behind episode 50, please. Just like forget about it. It just needs to be in the deep archives it needs to live on the dark web, and that's it. Don't, this does not need to be watched or consumed, because I think Not that that's bad content. It's just, man, we've learned so much from there, you know? And so, to piggyback off of that concept, off of that idea, I think there's, not only have we documented our process of growth for people to learn from, but I think a lot of people who are, day one OG listeners of the podcast, or those who have binged from the beginning, you've actually witnessed firsthand what it looked like to start a coffee roasting company from nothing, from scratch, from the bare minimum. Literally, we bootstrapped this thing from the ground up, and now you're able to witness such like a dynamic spectrum of growth to where we are today, 3.5 years later into this, into this business, into roasting coffee. And I think that's super exciting. It's almost like, those cool videos of like plants growing. It's like a time lapse.
Yeah,
like literally it's like, that's the podcast for all of you,
Yeah. Can you believe that if someone listened to 100 episodes of our podcast, they've listened to us talk for roughly 50 hours?
That's scary. That's scary.
That's way too scary for me. I don't want to think about it.
And my voice is annoying. That's terrible.
Same.
Yeah. So
wild.
Yeah. But that being said, you mentioned a little bit about the gear. We had one, maybe occasionally 2 cameras. We had like a little janky light that we were shooting on. Sometimes we had the mic, sometimes we didn't. It was rough. But over time, I think as we've seen the impact that this podcast has brought, how enjoyable it's been recording these podcasts and documenting these moments. I think to this setup, like most people who actually come across the podcast are like, oh damn, dude, that looks legit. Unreal, it looks cool.
Yeah.
And I'm like, actually, well, yeah, I guess so. Like I just had somebody like literally earlier today, I was on a shoot and they're like, oh yeah, dude, you own a coffee roasting company? And I clicked on your podcast. Like, it looks cool. I'm like, interesting. Yeah.
I guess.
Yeah, now we're shooting. We have a giant light overhead. It's like a light dome that's kind of softening the light, which is giving us this main key light. Makes things look, I think, pretty, gives interesting soft shadows. The blue light that you guys see in the shot is actually literally a tube light that is set to about the same color as our kind of brand colors. It's like this blue, which is shining up and reflecting off of these white walls. And then, we actually literally recently bought some newer podcast stands that are a little bit easier to move up and down. They're a little more durable. And then we're shooting on the mics, 2 Shure SM7Bs, which is
Cream of the crop.
Creme de la creme. And then for the cameras, we're shooting on 2 Canons right now. Actually, recent update, we're shooting on an R5 and then a Canon C70, which is a little bit of an overkill, but it'll do. And then recently I picked up a Zoom F6 field recorder. This Zoom recorder is unreal. It records in 32-bit float, which is pretty much like a raw recording. It's impossible almost to clip the audio on this guy. And it's also like, even if your audio is super quiet, you can bump the gain up and no noise is introduced. And this is like a recent addition over the last 2 months. I don't know if anybody has noticed. Probably not. But yeah, that's what makes this audio sound so crispy. But
I feel like I learned something. I had no idea about the F6, that it was that good. I actually didn't. I might, honest moment here, I don't even think I knew there was such a thing as recording raw audio. I know the video and the photo stuff, but I know nothing about audio, and thank God that you know something and you have a music background, so it kind of makes sense. So
I reckon.
Sheesh. I'm like, dang, that's a pretty cool thing if you can do that with it. That's super dope. No wonder it sounds so good too,
Yeah, it's a fun little device. Cost me almost an arm and a leg, but it'll do. But that all being said, I think if you're listening to this podcast, I think there are a few important things. Not only what we've already talked about, like a few important reasons why you should have a podcast. I think number one, it's a great way to document your process. I think number two also, I I think it helps you become a better communicator, because you're gonna have to listen to yourself back over, which I think is extremely helpful. And I think it's a fantastic way to connect with other people. I think that's probably one of my favorite things, is how many people we've been able to connect with who are listeners of the podcast, either who reached out to us later, or who, even the people who, if you're listening to this, you've been listening for a while and you haven't reached out, you haven't nothing, but you're just a consistent listener. Like, first off, thank you. But also, like, that's fantastic. Like, if it wasn't for this podcast, we probably wouldn't know, like, you probably wouldn't know about us. And yeah, that's a great way to connect with people. I don't know, any other important, I guess, are there any other important reasons why it would be valuable to have a podcast, either for yourself, if you're interested about something, a passion, a hobby, or maybe if there's, another coffee shop or coffee roaster that has a podcast?
Yeah, a few things for me. I think, well, from what I remember, one of the most impactful podcast episodes outside of our podcast for me was when I heard about Maxwell Mooney on an episode of the Break It Down podcast with Matt Carter, a musician from the band Emery. I think about that moment is so much of what I do now had to do with that single episode. So the impact of a podcast episode is, in my eyes, from my personal experience, is insane. One, as from Maxwell Mooney's perspective, as a business owner, as a consultant now, that's big. That someone heard of him through a podcast, and now I work for Narrative and all of that, right? For me, that helped me just dive into coffee like full-fledged by listening to that episode. So I think when you think about podcasts, especially coffee-related podcasts, you got to think of that dynamic. One, as a maybe coffee professional, like, this is great to just send out information to bring more people in to your network, to be able to connect, build relationships. But then as a podcast consumer, I mean, the possibilities are crazy. Same thing with like listening to Cat and Cloud and then running into Jared and the squad up at the SCA Expo. So stuff like that just, man, it's just so dynamic. It's way bigger than just posting like a photo or recording a video. So that's what I love about it. It's incredibly personal for me, but also now looking at it from a perspective as from Mirror, it's an amazing way to connect with guests and people that we just build relationships over just because we have this podcast.
Yeah, 100%. I think if you're listening to somebody talk for, what you just said, if you've been listening for 100 episodes, they're about 30 minutes long. That's 50 hours. Holy cow. Yeah. Do you learn a lot? But then also, do you connect with the person you're listening to so much, and we've had people, run into us, in public, in other countries even, who are like, man, I've been listening to you. I'm a fan, all this stuff. So, which is such an exciting part, So, I will say, if you're thinking about starting a podcast, it may feel overwhelming with all the gear and stuff. And actually, apart from this, for those of you who don't know, who might have missed it in previous episodes, I run kind of like a creative media agency a little bit, and I create content for brands. And one thing I've gotten into a lot is creating podcasts for brands, post-producing everything. And one of my video clients who just reached out and was like, man, I love your podcast. We're thinking about starting a podcast. What do you think I should get for, in terms of, do you have any advice on gear or anything? And I just said, hey, like, you don't really have to overthink it. Like, you can buy a mic for $100, or you can buy an SM7B for $400. You can buy like a $50 stand, or you can buy like a $110 stand. And it can be really overwhelming sometimes to think, man, I need all this gear, I need all the lights. No, listen. You can, if you really wanted to, you could just hit record on a voice memo and literally talk into the voice
100%.
memo. That's literally how easy it is. You don't even need the video. Like, the videos is, I'm biased, I think is a very important thing to have.
Yeah, same.
But honestly, hit record and communicate. If the end goal is to communicate and share valuable information, a podcast isn't really that difficult, you know?
Yeah. We break down the podcast setup very, very low key because when I went to Indonesia, I recorded a podcast out in the patio at a hotel.
Yeah.
And my suitcase wasn't even full. Like, I
sure.
did not bring no Pelican cases. I basically packed everything in my camera bag. So you can make it very simple. You don't have to overcomplicate it. And yeah, you just gotta record the content. You gotta be consistent, and you gotta make that stuff happen.
Yeah. The podcast thing may not be for everyone, and that's fair. But I think for those of you who have a knack for sharing information over like an audio way of communicating, I think I would 110% recommend people to start one. One of my clients actually is so bare bones. He has little to no time to create a podcast, but I'm like pushing him to create content, and he'll literally call somebody, his guest that he's interviewing, on Zoom. We'll record the Zoom call and record the screens, send me that, and I have audio, I have video to work with, and it's good to go. And literally, he has 0 mics. You guys, it could be really, really dumbed down if you really needed to, just to get it across so you're not overwhelmed by this. So,
when I was a guest on other podcasts, I actually used the wired Apple headphones. And that's very bare bones, but it sounded great.
And they could sound great. Yeah,
great.
that's the
Taylor
thing.
used some kind of wired headphones on an episode on our podcast, so you can make it work. It's not that you don't have to make it complicated. Is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
One
thing you need to figure out is get your, yeah. Gosh. One thing is figure out how to start the podcast.
Yeah, that's rough. That's rough. That's
so
why
hard.
I don't do it.
For those of you who literally, I cut all that out. Like today, I was just sitting there, staring, and blankly for like a minute straight, and I'm like, how am I gonna start this all over again?
I think part of it is that it can be kind of awkward because we are just chilling in the room with mics and talking to one another. You know what I mean? So there is that kind of sense of awkwardness. That's also part, I think, of the difficulty maybe of running a podcast is you have to get comfortable. And that doesn't always happen. Like just episode 1, the flow is perfect. That rarely, I don't know. Do you know of any one that you've worked with that from episode 1 was just like flawless at this?
I think there are a few naturals out there. I think so, but it's a very slim case. Like, trust me, most of my clients that we've started episode 1 or 2, and they ask me, "Hey, what would you think?" I'm like, "It's okay, we're getting there. Okay, this isn't bad." Because I know like people need to get used to the gist, getting to the flow. And I have a client that they're, I think, 5-6 episodes in. There's the three friends, coworkers that record the podcast, and man, they're finally in the gist of it. Episode 5-6 in, and it sounds stellar. So.
Yeah, that's also like getting through the first few episodes is difficult. Yeah, but then staying consistent and getting into the routine. Trust me. I don't know when, I feel like around episode 50 is when it felt for us like, all right, here's another day to record a podcast. Here we go. Let's do this again. Yeah. But getting through those first 50 episodes or even the first 100, yeah, it takes some commitment. It takes some work. It takes some, I'm going to nail this.
A lot of work.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining us on another episode of the Coffee Roaster Warm Sessions podcast. Hopefully this gave you guys a little snippet into what it's like to run a podcast. Maybe you're interested in starting a podcast. And if any of you have started a podcast from this, friends, send me episode 1, and I would love to listen to any podcast, coffee related or not. So anyways, thank you once again. And as we always say, wow, I forgot this ending. Reflect what's good.